The True Cost of Victory. How America Bankrupted the British Empire. Victory Celebrations. Silent Bankruptcy. 1 million people flood the streets, strangers embracing strangers, bonfires blazing across the capital. Churchill appears on the balcony of Buckingham Palace alongside the King and Queen, his famous V sign silhouetted against searchlights that, for the first time in 6 years, celebrate rather than warn. The war is over. Britain has won. The newsreels capture ecstatic crowds, sailors kissing nurses, children waving Union Jacks from their fathers' shoulders. Victory in Europe Day, the moment an entire nation had bled and sacrificed for, has finally arrived. But 3,000 miles away, in a nondescript Washington office, Treasury officials are tallying a very different kind of figure. Not casualties, not victories, but deaths. The numbers are staggering, almost incomprehensible. Britain owes the United States over $3 billion in Lend-Lease obligations alone. Its gold reserves, once the envy of the world, have been liquidated. Its foreign investments, painstakingly built over centuries of empire, have been sold off at fire sale prices to fund the war effort. The pound sterling, the bedrock of global finance for generations, is on life support. While Britain celebrated victory, it was simultaneously experiencing the most dramatic economic collapse of any major power in modern history, and most British citizens had no idea. The champagne toasts and victory parades masked a brutal truth that Churchill and his advisors understood all too well. Britain had won the war but lost its future. The empire that had dominated a quarter of the world's surface was, in financial terms, bankrupt. And the ally that had stood beside Britain, the United States, held all the outstanding debts. This is the story you weren't taught in school. The popular narrative tells us that America was the arsenal of democracy, generously supplying Britain with the weapons and resources needed to defeat Hitler, asking nothing in return except victory over tyranny. It's a comforting myth, one that both nations have found convenient to maintain. But the reality was far more transactional, far more calculating, and ultimately far more consequential than any battlefield victory or defeat. Here's the central question that should haunt anyone interested in how the modern world was truly forged. How did the ally that supposedly saved Britain also engineer its financial destruction? How did the war that Britain won on the battlefield become the instrument of its imperial demise? And how did the United States, joining the conflict years after Britain stood alone, emerge not just victorious, but as the undisputed financial superpower of the 20th century? The answer lies not in the courage of soldiers or the brilliance of generals, but in a series of financial arrangements, diplomatic negotiations, and economic agreements that systematically transferred wealth and power from London to Washington. Every shipment of American tanks, every bomber delivered, every barrel of oil came with strings attached, strings that would strangle Britain's economic independence and reshape the global order forever. The true bill for World War II wasn't paid on the beaches of Normandy or in the skies over Britain. It was paid through deals cut in smoke-filled rooms, through loan agreements signed in desperation, through the quiet dismantling of the financial architecture that had made Britain great. This is the story of how America bankrupted the British Empire. To understand the magnitude of Britain's collapse, you first need to grasp the heights from which it fell. In 1939, Britain wasn't just a major power, it was the financial superpower. London, not New York, was the undisputed center of global finance. The pound sterling functioned as the world's primary reserve currency, the standard against which other nations measured their wealth. British banks financed projects on every continent. British insurance companies underwrote commerce from Shanghai to São Paulo. The empire controlled roughly a quarter of the world's population and landmass, and that empire was held together not primarily by military force, but by an intricate web of financial relationships known as the Sterling Area. Britain's overseas investments were staggering, estimated at over £4 billion, generating hundreds of millions in annual income. Gold reserves sat secure in the Bank of England's vaults. The City of London's merchant banks had spent centuries perfecting the art of international finance, and their expertise was unmatched. When world trade needed financing, it came to London. When currencies needed stabilizing, they pegged to sterling. Britain had built a financial empire that, in many ways, was more valuable than its territorial one. Then came September 1939, and everything changed with terrifying speed. Modern industrial warfare operates at a scale that would have been unimaginable to previous generations. Britain needed not thousands of rifles, but millions. Not dozens of aircraft, but thousands. And Britain, for all its empire, couldn't produce enough domestically. The island nation had always depended on imports, food, raw materials, oil, but now it needed to import a modern war machine and import it immediately. Every tank, every bomber, every bullet had to be purchased with hard currency or gold. There was no credit in warfare, no payment plans for national survival. President Roosevelt wanted to help, but America in 1939 was gripped by fierce isolationism. The scars of World War I, the American boys who died in European trenches, the debts that European nations had defaulted on afterward were still fresh. Congress had passed strict neutrality acts designed to keep America out of foreign conflicts. The political solution was cash and carry. Britain could buy American weapons, but only if it paid cash up front and transported them in British ships. No credit. No American involvement. Show us the money or the deal's off. Churchill, who became Prime Minister in May 1940, faced an impossible equation. Britain's financial reserves were draining at a catastrophic rate, hemorrhaging millions of pounds every week to purchase American supplies. The Treasury began a desperate operation code named Operation Fish to secretly ship Britain's gold reserves and overseas securities across the U-boat-infested Atlantic to Canada and the United States. Billions in gold bars, stock certificates, and bonds were packed into crates and loaded onto warships in the dead of night, sent to secure vaults in North America. It was the largest movement of wealth in history, and it was done in absolute secrecy because if the British public knew their government was liquidating the nation's treasure, panic would ensue. Meanwhile, German U-boats prowled the Atlantic, sinking merchant vessels carrying both supplies and payment. Every ship that went down took British wealth with it, either in the form of lost goods or lost gold. The empire that looked so vast and powerful on maps was, behind closed doors, rapidly approaching insolvency. By late 1940, Britain's dollar reserves were nearly exhausted. Churchill sent increasingly desperate cables to Roosevelt. But American law was clear. No loans to belligerents, no credit for war materials. The United States Treasury, led by the meticulous Henry Morgenthau Jr., insisted on full payment for every transaction. Roosevelt sympathized with Britain, but faced enormous political constraints. American taxpayers, still recovering from the Depression, weren't eager to finance another European war. Congress watched every dollar. The isolation lobby was powerful and vocal. Roosevelt needed a solution that would help Britain survive without appearing to violate neutrality or give away American resources. On the British side, John Maynard Keynes, the brilliant economist now working for the Treasury, calculated and recalculated the numbers, and every calculation pointed to the same conclusion. Britain couldn't afford to both fight Germany and pay America. Something had to give. The empire that had financed the world for centuries was about to become a supplicant, a debtor nation dependent on American goodwill. The transformation from world's banker to desperate borrower happened not over decades but over months, and the speed of that collapse would determine the terms of every deal that followed. Britain needed America to survive. America knew it, and that knowledge would shape everything that came next.
The day the bill came due, by the time the last victory parades wound down, the real turning point of the war was already on Harry Truman's desk. 1 week after Japan's surrender, he signed a brief order that did more damage to Britain's prospects than 1,000 Luftwaffe raids. Lend-Lease was to be terminated at once. Cargoes already loaded under its terms were frozen. Some Liberty ships, heavy with grain and machinery bound for Liverpool, received instructions to turn back mid-Atlantic. Overnight, Britain's lifeline snapped. The empire that had bankrupted itself to win the war now found that the credit keeping its population fed had vanished with a stroke of an American pen. Into this crisis stepped John Maynard Keynes, exhausted, ill, and dispatched to Washington not as the triumphant architect of victory, but as a supplicant. He did not ask for charity. He asked for recognition that Britain's sacrifice had bought time for the United States to arm, mobilize, and emerge unscathed. He was told, politely, that sentimental gratitude was not on the table. What was on offer was a loan, $3.75 billion, at interest, tied to conditions that would pry open the pound's protected sphere. The harshest term was sterling convertibility. Within a year of receiving the money, Britain had to make its currency freely exchangeable for dollars. When this came into force in 1947, a torrent of pent-up claims hit sterling, reserves drained in weeks, convertibility was suspended, rationing deepened, and the promised peace dividend turned into grinding austerity. Yet the new order held. Gold and decision-making flowed to Washington. The dollar replaced sterling as the world's unquestioned reserve. Britain had helped defeat fascism, but the price of survival was dependency, a reality laid bare less than a decade later when the United States quietly vetoed its Suez adventure before the world.
By the late 1942, the imperial map still looked familiar. Red spread across Africa and Asia, British governors held levies, and London bankers spoke hopefully of sterling's recovery. Yet beneath them, the terms of Britain's existence had already changed. The empire that once financed others now lived on American credit. Dollar shortages, loan covenants, and IMF consultations quietly replaced gunboats and preference tariffs as the real limits on British power. Where previous crises had been handled in the City of London, post-war emergencies were settled in Washington at institutions Britain had helped design but no longer controlled.